She had been changing his IV drip every single morning, not to heal him, but to make sure he never stood up again. Jolene figured it out on a Tuesday, not from a document, not from a confession, from the way Genevieve smiled when Dominic's hands trembled too hard to lift a fork. That smile, slow, satisfied, like a woman watching something she planted finally bloom. Jolene's heart didn't break. It turned to iron. If you're just finding this channel, hit subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments, and stay until the end. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Jolene Carter had exactly $43 in her checking account, a bruise on her left wrist that she covered with a long-sleeve shirt even in July, and a name that followed her everywhere like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her father's name, Raymond Carter, convicted, federal charges, fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. The kind of charges that didn't just put a man away, they burned the ground around him, scorched every name attached to him, and left people like Jolene standing in the ash trying to convince strangers she was nothing like him. She was 31 years old, and she had already lost 4 jobs because of what her last name carried. The 5th one ended on a Wednesday morning, 11 minutes before her shift was supposed to start. "We have to let you go, Jolene." Her manager, a woman named Patrice who wore reading glasses she never actually used to read, slid an envelope across the desk without making eye contact. The background check flagged some concerns. Jolene didn't yell. She didn't cry. She had learned a long time ago that falling apart in front of people who already didn't respect you only gave them more ammunition. "What concerns?" she asked quietly. Patrice finally looked up, and in her eyes Jolene saw it not cruelty exactly, but something worse. Pity wrapped in discomfort. "Your father's record creates a liability issue for the firm." "I'm sorry." "My father's record," Jolene repeated slowly. "Not mine." "Company policy, Jolene." She picked up the envelope, stood, smoothed her skirt with both hands. "I've never had so much as a parking ticket, Patrice." Patras opened her mouth. "Don't," Jolene said softly. "Please, just don't." She walked out into the July heat and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, letting the sun press down on her shoulders like a hand. Not comforting, just heavy. $43, no job. Rent due in 9 days. She walked 3 blocks before she realized she'd been walking towards street Michael's without deciding to go there. It was the one place in the city that never asked her last name. The old priest there, Father Callum, had baptized her as an infant, had buried her mother when Jolene was 7, had visited her in the group home when she was 12 and her father went away the first time. He never asked her what she'd done wrong. He just prayed with her and told her that God had a long memory and an even longer plan. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore, but she went anyway. The church was cool inside and smelled like candle wax and old wood. It was empty in the middle of a Wednesday morning, just Jolene and the stained glass and the particular silence that old buildings hold like a breath. She sat in the 3rd pew from the front because that was where her mother used to sit her when she was small enough to dangle her feet above the kneeler. She hadn't thought about that in years. She thought about it now. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and stared at the cross above the altar and said out loud in a voice barely above a whisper, "I need something to change. I can't keep doing this." The door behind her opened. She didn't turn around. She assumed it was Father Callum. It wasn't. The footsteps were different, measured. The sound of expensive heels on old stone. Deliberate. The kind of walk that announced itself without apology. A woman sat down in the pew directly in front of Jolene. Not beside her. In front of her, facing forward like she was there to pray. She was somewhere in her 60s, dressed in a charcoal suit that had not come off any rack. Her silver hair pulled back with the kind of precision that looked effortless and cost a fortune. She smelled like gardenias and something Jolene couldn't name, something cold underneath the sweetness. "You're Jolene Carter," the woman said, still facing forward. She hadn't looked back. Jolene went very still. "I'm sorry, do I know you, No." A pause. "But I know your father." The air in the church felt like it dropped 10 degrees. "I'm not my father," Jolene said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended because she had said those exact words so many times they had worn a groove in her throat. "I know that too." The woman turned then. Her eyes were dark gray, not brown, not blue, actually gray, and they assessed Jolene the way a contractor assesses a building before buying it, looking for cracks, looking for what held. My name is Genevieve Marchetti. I believe you need employment. I believe I need a caregiver. Jolene blinked. A caregiver? My son. Genevieve's expression didn't shift. He was in an accident 14 months ago. He requires full-time care. Someone in the house available around the clock, trustworthy, discreet. A small pause on that last word, just enough to make it land. Someone who understands that what happens inside a private home stays inside a private home. Jolene looked at this woman, the composed face, the gray eyes, the hands folded in her lap, like she was already bored with the conversation, even though she had started it. How did you find me? Jolene asked. I find everyone I need to find eventually. Genevieve said it without arrogance, just fact. The position pays $4,000 a month, housing included. You would have your own room, meals provided, 2 days off per week. She tilted her head slightly. Based on your current situation, I believe this is what some people would call an answer to prayer. Jolene did not miss the timing of that. She sat in God's house, $43 to her name, 9 days from eviction, and a woman she had never met appeared from nowhere and offered her everything she needed. In her experience, when something looked exactly like what you needed most, it was usually the thing most likely to destroy you. I'd want to meet your son first, Jolene said. For just a fraction of a second, less than a breath, something moved in Genevieve Marchetti's gray eyes. Not quite displeasure, not quite surprise. Something in between, quickly smoothed over. Of course, she said and smiled. Tomorrow morning, I'll send a car. She should have said no. She knew that then. She knew it the way you know the stove is hot before you touch it, not from the burn, but from the heat you can feel already reaching toward your palm. She said yes anyway. Because $43, because rent, because a woman can only be principled up to the point where principle won't keep the lights on. She told herself it was temporary, just long enough to get back on her feet, just long enough to find something better. That was how traps work, she would later understand. They always offered you exactly enough to walk inside. Time. The car came at 8 the next morning. Black, quiet. The driver didn't speak to her the entire 40-minute drive, which told Jolene something about the kind of household she was entering, one where staff did not make small talk, did not form attachments, did not ask questions. The house was large. That was all she let herself register. Large setback from the road surrounded by the kind of landscape that was not decorative, but strategic shrubbery that blocked sightlines, a gate that required a code cameras at angles she noticed without appearing to notice. She was taken to a sitting room. Genevieve arrived within minutes, already dressed, as though the day had been going on without Jolene for hours. I'll take you to Dominic before we discuss the specifics, Genevieve said. Not a question. They walked down a corridor Jolene tried to map in her mind. Left, right, past a staircase that went up. Another door that stayed closed. Then a room at the end of a hall, and Genevieve knocked twice before opening it. He was in a wheelchair by the window. That was Jolene's first clear image of Dominic Marchetti, a man who looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, broad-shouldered even in stillness, with the kind of build that spoke to something physical in his past. Dark hair starting to show gray at the temples. A jaw that would have been commanding if it hadn't been slack with whatever he was medicated on. His eyes, though, his eyes were the problem. They were not the eyes of someone medicated into docility. They were sharp, watchful, dark, and very awake. They tracked Jolene from the moment she walked in the door, assessing her the same way his mother had, but differently, not calculating exactly. More like a man reading a situation to determine whether it was a threat. Dominic, Genevieve said, this is Jolene Carter. She'll be your new caregiver. He looked at Jolene, said nothing. Genevieve tilted her head. You can say hello, darling. Hello, he said. His voice was low, a little rough, like someone who didn't use it much. He was looking at Jolene as he said it, but she had the distinct impression he wasn't speaking to her. He was testing whether he was allowed to. Something about that made her stomach clench. I can speak for myself, Jolene said, and she said it to Dominic directly, not to Genevieve. And I'm happy to hear from you directly too, Mr. Marchetti, if that's easier. A pause, and for just a moment, barely perceptible there and gone, something shifted in his face. Not a smile, too careful for that, but the edge of something, recognition maybe, like she had said a word in a language he hadn't heard in a long time. Genevieve made a small sound, not disapproval, almost approval, actually quick, controlled. She's direct. I think that's good for you, Dominic. Wonderful, Dominic said flatly and looked back out the window. Genevieve walked Jolene through the duties in crisp, efficient language. Morning routine, medication schedule, and she was specific here, pulling out a folded paper with precise times and doses already written and laminated. Physical assessments, meal supervision. She was not to take Dominic outside the property without prior authorization. She was not to allow Badens into his room without notification. She was not to discuss Dominic's condition with anyone outside the household. And the medication, Jolene said, looking at the laminated sheet. Who prescribed this? Genevieve met her eyes. Dr. Hewitt. He visits monthly. Everything is documented. I'd want to see the documentation. Jolene said it evenly, just to make sure I'm administering correctly. For his safety. Another of those nearly invisible pauses. Of course. That night in the room, she'd been given clean small with a window that faced the back of the property. Jolene lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way Dominic's eyes had followed her out of the room. Not like someone who needed help, like someone who needed rescue. She told herself she was reading too much into it. She told herself it was just a job. She told herself that in the morning she would start and it would be ordinary and she would be grateful for the paycheck. She fell asleep eventually. She dreamed about her mother's hands, specifically the way they used to smooth Jolene's hair back from her forehead, and woke up at 3 a.m. with the absolute certainty that something in this house was very wrong. She lay still in the dark and tried to name what was raising every hair on her arms. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the laminated medication sheet, the specific unblinking detail of it. The way Genevieve had produced it, not because Jolene had asked, but preemptively before any question was raised. Like a woman who had already rehearsed this conversation, like a woman who had done this before. The first 2 weeks Jolene watched. She was good at watching, growing up the way she had in group homes and temporary placements, in the constant uncertainty of a childhood without permanent ground. She had learned to read rooms the way other people read maps, looking for exits, looking for patterns, looking for the thing that didn't fit. Dominic was medicated 3 times a day. The medication came from bottles that lived in a locked cabinet in his bathroom. Genevieve held the key. Only Genevieve. Jolene administered the doses as instructed. She didn't touch the bottles herself. They were already measured into small paper cups by Genevieve each morning before Jolene was awake. But she watched what happened to Dominic in the hours after. The heaviness, the way his hands would slow, the way his already limited movement became more limited. The way he'd sometimes look at her from across the room with that sharp, awake intelligence flickering behind eyes that his body was busy betraying. On the 9th day, Jolene was helping him with his lunch when he said quietly and without any change in expression, "She watches the cameras at 10 a.m. every day. 15 minutes. Jolene didn't react. She kept her face neutral, kept her hands moving, kept everything ordinary. "That's interesting," she said. "I thought you might find it so." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "You're more aware than you let on." His jaw tightened. "Most people in this house prefer it when I'm not." She thought about that for a long time after he ate. On the 14th day, she found the first crack. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for extra towels in the hall closet she had asked Genevieve had told her second shelf, and the second shelf had no towels, only boxes. One of the boxes had slid and she caught it before it fell, and in catching it, she felt the weight of it in the rattle. She put it back without opening it, but she remembered the sound. Glass vials, she thought, small ones, like prescription vials but smaller. She put the box back exactly as she found it, closed the closet door, got towels from the linen room she found down another hallway. And that night she lay in bed and thought, what does a woman keep in a locked cabinet and a closed box in a hallway if she is genuinely taking care of a sick son? And then the darker question, the one that came after and refused to leave. What does a woman keep those things from, if not a caregiver she has specifically employed to monitor his medication? By morning, Jolene had stopped thinking of this as a job. She had started thinking of it as a puzzle. And the picture forming at the center of the puzzle was one that made her blood run cold. Because Dominic Marchetti, whose mother said was paralyzed in an accident 14 months ago, Dominic Marchetti, whose eyes tracked movement like a man who had spent a lifetime being dangerous occasionally when he didn't think Jolene was watching, moved his left hand, not the trembling grip of someone with nerve damage. A deliberate, controlled movement, like a man quietly testing the limits of a cage. He was not fully paralyzed. He knew she was watching, and this morning, for the first time, he watched her back and waited to see what she would do. Jolene Carter had $43 the day she walked into St. Michael's Church and asked God for something to change. She was 3 weeks inside the Marchetti house now, and she understood with the clarity of cold water on skin that something had already changed, just not in the direction she expected. She wasn't a caregiver. She was a witness. And somewhere between the laminated medication sheet, the locked cabinet, the rattling box in the hallway, and a pair of dark eyes that moved when they weren't supposed to, Jolene Carter had become something even more dangerous than she intended. She had started paying attention. Jolene had made a rule for herself a long time ago: never ask a question you're not ready to hear the answer to. She had broken that rule exactly twice in her life. Once when she was 12 and asked a social worker if her father was coming back. Once when she was 19 and asked the man she thought she loved if he actually meant it. Both times the answer had gutted her. She was about to break her own rule a third time. It was the 22nd day inside the Marchetti house. She knew the rhythms of the place the way you learn the rhythms of a body, the sounds it made, the moments it held its breath, the exact points where it was most vulnerable. She knew that Genevieve left for her weekly appointment every Thursday at 11 and didn't return until 2. She knew the housekeeper, a quiet woman named Rosa, who kept her eyes pointed at the floor and answered every question with exactly as few words as possible, took her lunch break at noon, and stayed in the kitchen for 45 minutes. She knew the security guard who walked the outer perimeter did his rounds on the hour every hour, and that between 12:15 and 12:40, the camera in the east corridor glitched a small, consistent blip that she had noticed by accident and confirmed by watching for 3 days in a row. She knew all of this because Dominic had told her. Not all at once, not in any way that looked like telling. In fragments slipped into ordinary conversation, casual as weather. The east camera has for months, offered while she adjusted his pillow. Rosa doesn't like conflict. She won't mention anything she sees unless she's asked directly. Said while she handed him water. My mother reviews the camera footage every Sunday evening, not daily. Dropped between sentences about nothing like coins falling from a pocket. He was giving her a map. She hadn't asked for it. He hadn't explained it. But she understood what it was, and she understood what he was asking her to do with it. On the 22nd day at 12:17, when the east corridor camera was in its glitch window, and Rosa was in the kitchen, and the house was as empty of eyes as it was ever going to be, Jolene went to the hall closet. She opened it. Moved the second box, not the one that had fallen, the one behind it. She had done the math over 3 weeks and understood that whatever was in the first box was meant to be found if someone was careless. The second box was for someone who wasn't looking. Inside were 3 things: a handwritten log in Genevieve's precise looping script, a photograph, and a small, unlabeled amber vial. She didn't touch any of it with her bare hands. She had come prepared with gloves she'd bought herself at a drugstore 2 towns over, paying cash, because she was her father's daughter. In at least one way she understood evidence. She understood what happened when you left your fingerprints in places they shouldn't be. She read the log first. It took her 4 minutes. Every entry was dated. Every entry corresponded to a day Dominic had received his medication. And beside each date were 2 columns, one that read like clinical notation, dosage amounts, and observations. The kind of language a person learned from medical literature. The other column was different, personal, almost tender. Things like much calmer today, and the trembling is consistent now, and on one entry that made Jolene's hand go completely still, tried to use the phone. Must eliminate access. She looked at the photograph. It was Dominic, standing. Not in a wheelchair, not slumped against anything, standing straight in what looked like an office, one hand resting on a desk, looking at the camera, with an expression that was not warm, but was very much alive. At the bottom of the photograph was a date stamp. 11 months ago, 3 months after the accident that Genevieve said had left him unable to walk. Jolene put everything back exactly as she found it. She walked back to Dominic's room on legs that felt distant from her body. She knocked twice. She always knocked and went in. He was at the window. His hands were in his lap. His face was turned away from her. "Rosa's still at lunch," she said. "Yes, I know," he said. She sat down in the chair she always used, not too close, not too far. The chair that said, "I'm here, but I'm not hovering." She had learned that he needed space the way some people needed air. "The log goes back 11 months, she said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. She could see his jaw work just slightly, like a man chewing on something he'd been holding in his mouth for a very long time. "How detailed?" he asked. His voice was steady, too steady, the steadiness of someone who had spent months making his face a wall. "Detailed enough," she paused. "The photograph. You were standing 11 months ago." He turned from the window then. And for the first time since she had come to this house, Dominic Marchetti let her see his face without the careful blankness he wore like armor. What was underneath it was not what she expected. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something colder and deeper, the look of a man who has been drowning for so long he almost forgot he ever knew how to swim. "She told Dr. Hewitt I had a psychiatric break," he said, "that I was delusional, convinced myself I could walk when I couldn't." A pause. He believed her, or he chose to believe her. "I'm not sure which is worse." Jolene leaned forward. "How long have you been able to feel your legs?" His jaw tightened. "Since month 3. The accident was real, there was spinal trauma. But the prognosis was recovery with physical therapy, possible full recovery." He stopped, started again. "She started the medication shortly after the accident. By month 3, I was showing improvement. By month 4, I was losing it again." He looked at her. "It took me 2 more months to understand why." "She's keeping you dependent," Jolene said. She said it plainly because soft language was a luxury they didn't have. "The medication, she's suppressing recovery." "The company," his voice dropped. "My father built it. When he died, it passed to me. If I'm incapacitated legally, medically documented as unable to manage my own affairs, the board gives operational control to the next of kin." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. "There's a board meeting in 6 weeks. Major acquisition. Worth $300 million. She needs my signature on the transfer or she needs me declared incompetent. She's been working toward incompetence." Jolene sat with that for 3 full seconds. "Does anyone outside this house know the truth?" she asked. "My lawyer, Marcus Ewan." Something crossed his face, quick, almost painful. "She told him I'd had another break, that I'd become paranoid and was making accusations. He hasn't returned my calls in 2 months. A beat. I don't have access to a phone she hasn't monitored." "Yes, you do," Jolene said. He went very still. She pulled out the phone she had bought prepaid cash, same drugstore as the gloves, and held it where he could see it. She hadn't planned exactly when she would reveal it, but this was the moment. She could feel it the way you feel the shift before a storm. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Why?" he asked. "Just that. With not thank you and not how did you know, just the question that mattered most. Why was she doing this? Why was she risking this?" "Because I've spent my whole life being told I'm responsible for what someone else did," Jolene said. "And I'm not going to watch that happen to someone else if I can stop it." He called Marcus Ewan that afternoon during Rosa's lunch break, his voice low and precise, and stripped of every emotion except authority. She stood by the door and listened, not to the words but to his tone, because that tone told her something Genevieve had apparently forgotten. This was not a broken man. This was a man who had been very carefully made to appear broken. And the difference between those two things was the difference between someone you could control indefinitely and someone who was just waiting for a crack in the wall. Marcus Ewan's response, from what Jolene could parse from Dominic's half of the conversation, was cautious, uncertain. The voice of a man who had been told a story so many times he'd stopped questioning whether it was true. Dominic hung up and sat with the phone in his hands for a moment. "He'll call back," he said. "Maybe. If he doesn't, then we find someone who will." He handed the phone back to her. Their hands didn't touch. Neither of them made that happen by accident. "There's a woman, Elaine Pryor. She worked with my father's legal team for 20 years. My mother doesn't know about her. She was never listed in any of the company documents because my father kept her separate for exactly this kind of situation. He paused. He was a careful man. Smart man, Jolene said. He was also the reason my mother married into a life that ate people, Dominic said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite love and not quite blame and lived in the complicated space between them. He built all of this. She just decided she was owed a larger piece of it than he left her. Jolene filed that away. Filed the way he said my mother, with that particular flatness that came from a grief too old and too deep to be raw anymore, the grief of someone who had loved a person and lost them not to death, but to who they chose to be. She understood that kind of loss, more than she wanted to. I'll find Elaine Pryor, she said. Give me what you can. She found her in 4 days. Not through the internet, she was careful about searches on house Wi-Fi, but through a series of calls made on the prepaid phone during camera glitch windows, working outward from the information Dominic had given her following threads the way her father had once taught her to play chess. You didn't look at where the piece was, you looked at where it could go. Elaine Pryor was 71 years old, sharp as a tack, and when Jolene told her who she was calling on behalf of, there was a pause on the line that contained an entire history. Is he alive? Elaine asked. Yes. Is he lucid? Completely. Another pause. Longer. I told Vincent, that's Dominic's father. I told him that woman was going to be a problem. She didn't say it with any pleasure. What do you need? What Jolene needed, it turned out Elaine could provide in ways that opened up the situation like a key in a lock. Elaine had documentation, old contracts, financial records, a letter Vincent Marchetti had written and notarized and given to Elaine 7 years before he died, outlining his specific wishes for the company in the event of his incapacitation or death, and explicitly naming the conditions under which Genevieve could and could not assume control. She doesn't meet those conditions, Elaine said. She never has. If Dominic is competent, medically documented as competent, she has no legal standing, none. She's been doctoring the medical record, Jolene said. Then we need a clean one, an independent physician, someone she can't reach. Jolene thought about the locked cabinet, the laminated medication sheet, the amber vial. What happens if someone can demonstrate the medication she's been giving him isn't what's prescribed? The silence on Elaine's end was the silence of a very experienced person recalibrating. Then we're no longer talking about a civil dispute, Elaine said carefully. We're talking about something considerably more serious. Yes, Jolene said, I know. She stopped administering the afternoon medication on day 29. Not the morning dose. She couldn't explain away a complete change in his pattern without raising flags. But the afternoon dose, she switched. She had researched the medication, cross-referenced it with everything she could access on the prepaid phone, and identified a compound that was not on any legitimate prescription Dominic's records showed. It wasn't enough to incapacitate. It was just enough taken 3 times daily for 11 months to keep the muscles weak, the coordination unreliable, the trembling consistent. She replaced the afternoon dose with a B-complex vitamin she'd sourced from the same drugstore, same cash transaction, that matched the capsule size closely enough that anyone filling the paper cup without opening the cabinet would not notice the difference. The first day, nothing visible changed. The second day at dinner, Dominic lifted his water glass with his right hand without it shaking. He met her eyes across the table. He didn't react. Neither did she. But she saw it and he saw her see it, and something passed between them in that moment that had no name and didn't need one. Genevieve, who was at the table that evening, was looking at her phone. She didn't see it. But Jolene watched her anyway, watched the composed profile of that woman who had sat in a church and offered salvation that was really just a more sophisticated kind of cage. And she thought, you made one mistake. You hired someone with nothing left to lose and called it safe. On the 31st day, Genevieve came to Jolene's room after dinner. She knocked. She didn't wait for an answer before opening the door, and Jolene noted that Storted understood what it communicated about how Genevieve categorized the people in her house. I want to talk to you about Dominic, Genevieve said. She sat on the edge of the desk chair, didn't ask, just sat and folded her hands. Have you noticed any changes in his behavior recently? Every hair on Jolene's body stood up. She kept her face open, curious. slightly concerned in the way a conscientious employee would be. Changes how, i.e., agitation, elevated mood, possibly some confusion about his condition. Genevieve watched her. Those gray eyes were doing what they always did, looking for cracks. Sometimes patients in his situation develop what we call a false sense of recovery. It can be distressing. It can also be dangerous for them and for the people caring for them if they act on it. Jolene let a beat pass. 2. I haven't noticed anything like that. No, Genevieve tilted her head. He hasn't said anything to you about his condition, about his prognosis. He's told me he's frustrated, Jolene said carefully. That's natural, isn't it, for someone in his situation? Genevieve smiled. It was the same smile Jolene had once read as composed. She now understood it for what it was, a smile that had been constructed to look like warmth and functioned as surveillance. Of course, we just want to make sure we are managing his expectations appropriately. She stood, smoothed her jacket. Dr. Hewitt will be coming earlier than usual this month. Next Friday. I want you to be available. Of course, Jolene said. Genevieve moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the frame. Jolene, you've been good for this household. I mean that. I hope you feel settled here. I do, Jolene said. I'm grateful for the opportunity. The door closed. Jolene sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat on her thighs, the same gesture she had made in the church on the day this all began, and breathed slowly through her nose and thought 3 things in rapid succession. Genevieve knew something was shifting. Dr. Hewitt coming early meant a new assessment, a new official record. Whatever she was planning it before the board meeting. She was accelerating. And Jolene had exactly 8 days to move faster than a woman who had already been playing this game for 14 months. She picked up the prepaid phone and sent one text to Elaine Pryor. 4 words. We need to move. The reply came in under a minute. Already moving. Trust me. Jolene stared at those 2 words, trust me, and almost laughed. Because trust was the most expensive thing she had ever been asked to spend, and she had just handed it to a 71-year-old lawyer she had spoken to 6 times on a burner phone. But then again, she had also handed it weeks ago to a man in a wheelchair who had given her a map of his mother's surveillance schedule before she'd ever given him a reason to. And so far, neither of them had given her cause to regret it. So far. She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling and thought about the amber vial in the closet, about the log with its careful handwritten columns, about a photograph dated 11 months ago of a man standing on his own 2 feet. She thought about Genevieve Marchetti sitting in a church god's house with gardenia perfume and gray eyes and an offer that looked like answered prayer. And she thought the thing about poison is that it always looks like medicine until you know what to look for. Jolene Carter knew what to look for now. And in 8 days, she was going to make sure everyone else did too. 8 days sounds like time. It sounds like space to breathe, to plan, to move carefully. Jolene had lived through enough emergencies to know better. 8 days was nothing. 8 days was a held breath. 8 days when someone with power and resources and 14 months of practice was accelerating toward a goal was closer to 8 hours if you weren't already ahead of her. Jolene was not ahead of her. Not yet. She spent the first of those 8 days doing something that looked from every camera angle in the house like nothing at all. She helped Dominic with breakfast. She read to him. He had asked her once casually if she would read aloud from the business journal stacked near his window, and she had understood this not as a request for entertainment, but as a way to keep his mind sharp, to keep feeding the part of him that Genevieve had been trying to starve. She administered his morning medication as always. She hadn't touched the morning dose, only the afternoon, and she was precise and consistent and gave Genevieve nothing to flag. But while she poured his coffee, she said quietly without looking at him, Hewitt comes in 8 days. What does he actually do when he's here? Dominic picked up his coffee cup with his right hand, steady, noticeably steadier than even 3 days ago. Observation mostly, reflexes. He asked me questions designed to assess cognitive function. Standard neurological evaluation. A pause. Then he files his report and my mother reviews it before it goes anywhere official. Jolene looked at him then. She reviews it first. She has for 11 months. His voice was flat, but his eyes weren't. The first 2 assessments I tried to tell him the truth. He documented it as evidence of confusion and paranoid ideation. He set the cup down. After that, I stopped trying. You stopped fighting, she said. Not an accusation. An observation, his jaw tightened. I stopped fighting that particular battle. I wasn't done fighting. She nodded slowly. Then here's what's going to happen. Elaine is bringing an independent neurologist. Someone Hewitt doesn't know. Someone your mother has no relationship with. We need that physician inside this house before Hewitt gets here. He stared at her. She controls who comes in. She controls who she knows about. Jolene picked up his breakfast plate, moving with the ordinary rhythm of her job, keeping everything looking like nothing. Elaine is working on it. We just need to keep Genevieve looking in the wrong direction for a few more days. And if she isn't looking in the wrong direction, Jolene met his eyes, then we improvise. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. You say that like it's simple. Nothing about this is simple, she said, but simple isn't the goal. Forward is the goal. The problem with keeping Genevieve looking in the wrong direction was that Genevieve was not a woman who looked in wrong directions easily. She was careful with her attention the same way she was careful with everything deliberately comprehensively with a long memory for detail. On the second day, she came to watch Dominic's morning routine, which she hadn't done in weeks. She stood in the doorway of his room with a cup of tea and observed as Jolene helped him with his stretches, and her eyes moved between the two of them in a way that was clinical and quiet and made Jolene's skin feel like it was the wrong size. His color is better, Genevieve said finally. Rest has been more consistent, Jolene said. She didn't look up from what she was doing. Keep moving. Keep the hands busy. I adjusted the afternoon schedule, slightly less stimulation in the hour before his rest period. It's made a difference. A beat. Dominic, are you sleeping better? Fine, he said, flat. The one-word answers he gave his mother had a texture to them not hostile enough to provoke, not cooperative enough to invite more conversation. A perfect practiced neutrality. Genevieve sipped her tea. Good. Dr. Hewitt will want to hear that. She left without saying goodbye to either of them. The moment the door closed, Jolene exhaled through her nose. She didn't stop the stretch. She just exhaled and kept moving and did not look at Dominic's face because she already knew what she'd find there, that particular blankness that cost him something every time he deployed it. She's watching more closely, he said. Yes. She suspects something. She suspects something, Jolene agreed. She doesn't know what yet. That's the window. On the third day, Rosa stopped her in the hallway. This was notable because Rosa did not stop people in hallways. Rosa moved through the house like a woman who had learned that invisibility was safety, and she extended that lesson to every interaction she had. She responded, she did not initiate. But she stopped Jolene, and she looked at her with eyes that were tired and careful and not unkind. And she said very quietly, Mrs. Marchetti asked me about you this morning. Jolene kept her breathing even. What did she ask? Whether you used your phone a lot, whether you'd had any visitors, whether you left the property on your days off and where you went. Rosa paused. I told her I didn't notice, which is true. I make it a point not to notice things in this house. Jolene looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then Mr. Dominic, before all of this, he was a serious man. Difficult man sometimes. But he used to bring me coffee from that place, 2 streets over, the real Cuban kind, because he remembered once I said I missed it from when I was a girl. She stopped. He doesn't bring coffee anymore. That's all I wanted to say. She walked away before Jolene could respond. Jolene stood in the hallway and let that sit in her chest for a moment, the weight of a small kindness, a small loyalty, offered sideways from a woman who had survived this house by never appearing to take sides. Then she walked to her room and texted Elaine one word faster. The reply came 2 hours later, and it was not what Jolene expected. It was a name. Dr. Patricia Osei, attached to 3 initials, MD, PhD, F, AAN, in a single line. She owes me a debt she's been wanting to repay for 12 years. She'll come. Thursday. Thursday was day 5, 3 days before Hewitt. Jolene read the message twice, then deleted it, cleared the phone's history, and sat very still for a moment doing the math. Thursday, Dr. Osei came. Friday, they had the documentation. The weekend, Elaine filed. Monday, 2 days before Hewitt, the paperwork was already in motion. It was tight. It was so tight, it was almost not a plan, almost just a hope wearing a plan's clothing. She thought of her father. Raymond Carter, who'd have been many things she was not proud of, but who had also once told her sitting across a visitation table when she was 16, his hands folded and his eyes clear. In that way they got, sometimes when the man she remembered before everything surfaced through the surface of who he'd become. Jolene, every plan looks impossible until it's already done. The doing is the only way through. She had spent 15 years being angry at him. She was occasionally grateful for the things he taught her anyway. Life was complicated like that. Thursday, she texted back, which entrance occupied? She told Dominic that evening. Not in his room, Genevieve had added a camera to the hallway directly outside his door, which they had both noticed and neither had acknowledged aloud. She told him during the afternoon stretch routine, speaking at normal volume about the exercises, while underneath the ordinary words, she laid out what was coming, what she needed from him, what the next 5 days required. He listened. She could see him processing it, not just the information, but the implications, the risks, the specific ways it could go wrong. He was a man who had built a business from the foundation his father left, which meant he understood systems and leverage and the point at which a risk became worth taking. When she finished, he said, still in the flat tone of a man doing physiotherapy, "If OC examines me and documents clean cognition and partial motor recovery, Genevieve will know immediately that someone interfered with the medication." "Yes," Jolene said. "That puts you directly in her line of sight." "I'm already in her line of sight," Jolene said. "Rosa told me so." He went still for a moment. "Rosa talked to you?" "She told me Genevieve was asking questions about my habits, about my phone, about where I go." The muscle in his jaw worked. "She's building a case. She'll try to discredit you before you can do anything useful. Unstable background, criminal family history." He stopped himself. "I'm sorry, that wasn't—" "It's accurate," Jolene said. She said it without flinching because she had spent enough years flinching from it and it hadn't protected her. "It's also why I've been careful. Everything I've done, I can account for. Everything I've touched, I've documented." She paused. "I learned from someone who didn't do that, and I watched what happened to him." Dominic looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt it. "When this is over," he said, "I want to hear about your father." "When this is over," she said, "I might actually tell you." Thursday came the way important days always do, ordinary on the surface, electric underneath. Dr. Patricia Osei was a small woman in her 50s, with close-cut, natural hair, wire-rimmed glasses, in the particular economy of movement that belonged to people who had spent decades doing precise and consequential work. She arrived at the back gate at the time Elaine had arranged through a connection Jolene still didn't fully understand, a former household employee, a sister-in-law, a door that was unlocked during a 20-minute window, when the gate camera looped on old footage, something Jolene had not asked about and Elaine had not explained, and that was fine because some gifts you accepted without examining the wrapping. Jolene brought her to Dominic's room in the gap between Rosa's lunch break and the hour before Genevieve returned from her Thursday appointment. They had exactly 70 minutes, Doctor. Osei set her bag down, looked at Dominic with the direct, unadorned attention of someone who evaluated people for a living and was not performing it, and said, "I've read the official file. I want to start by telling you that I'm not bound by it, and anything you say or demonstrate here is between us and the legal record we're building. Nothing goes to anyone in this house." She paused. "Do you understand by—" "Yes," Dominic said. "Can you tell me in your own words what your current physical experience is?" And something happened then that Jolene had not quite anticipated, or rather she had anticipated it intellectually, but experiencing it was different. Dominic talked, fully, precisely, without the careful, edited blankness he used with everyone else in this house. He described the accident, the initial paralysis, the slow return of sensation in month 2, the improvement that had started in month 3, and then stalled and reversed as the medication was adjusted. He described what it felt like to have a body that he knew was capable of more than it was performing, like trying to shout through a wall that kept getting thicker. He described the morning he realized what was happening to him and the decision he'd made to appear compliant, to conserve what function he had to wait. Dr. Osei listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Show me." He showed her. It wasn't dramatic. It was not a sudden standing, not a movie moment. He gripped the arm of the wheelchair and shifted his weight with deliberate, effortful control, and he moved his legs, both of them with measurable intention, his left stronger than his right, but both responding. His hands, when she tested grip's strength, registered far above what 11 months of complete paralysis would allow. His reflexes were present, his coordination impaired, but present. His cognition, she tested it thoroughly methodically, was completely intact. She wrote for several minutes without speaking. Then she said, "The compound you described in the medication, do you have access to a sample?" Jolene had the amber vial in her pocket. She had taken it from the closet on day 6, replaced it with an empty identical vial she'd sourced from a medical supply website, and trusted that Genevieve would not check every vial in that box before Hewitt's visit. She handed it to Dr. Osei. The doctor looked at it, turned it, said nothing, put it in her bag. "I'll have a full toxicology analysis by tomorrow morning," she said. "Elaine will have the neurological documentation within the hour." She stood, looked at Dominic. "I want you to know what's been done to you has a name. It's a crime, and I am going to say so in writing in language that no one will be able to misread." Dominic said nothing for a moment. Then, "Thank you." Dr. Osei looked at Jolene. "How much longer can you hold this house?" "As long as I have to," Jolene said. The doctor nodded once, then she was gone back through the route she'd come, the door closing quietly behind her. And the room felt different in her absence, heavier and lighter. At the same time, the way air feels after a storm has passed through and left the sky changed. Jolene looked at Dominic. He was staring at his own hands, his left hand specifically. He was opening and closing it slowly, watching it like it belonged to someone he was only just being reintroduced to. "Hey," she said softly. He looked up. "It's going to hold," she said. "The documentation, the toxicology Elaine's filing, it's going to hold." He didn't say "I know" because he was too honest a man to say things he couldn't guarantee. What he said was, "I trust you." 3 words, said simply without theater. And they hit her somewhere in the sternum like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was closed. She picked up the prepaid phone. She texted Elaine Dunn, "Clean." The reply from Elaine came at 9 that evening, filing with the court first thing Monday. Hewitt won't be able to walk those findings back. Get Dominic to document his own account tonight, written, signed, dated. Keep it on your person, not the phone. Jolene went to Dominic's room after dinner. Genevieve had been at the table that night, quieter than usual, which was its own kind of alarm. Genevieve quiet was not Genevieve at rest. It was Genevieve thinking. She gave him the paper and the pen and told him what Elaine needed. He wrote for 40 minutes. 11 months of carefully observed experience translated into the precise, organized language of a man who had run a company, dates, symptoms, observations, the exact moment he understood what was being done to him, and the specific ways he had adapted to survive it. When he finished, he signed it and dated it and folded it and handed it to her. She put it inside the lining of the jacket she wore every day, the one she'd bought specifically because it had an interior pocket deep enough that nothing fell out if the jacket was hung up. "That's everything we have," she said. "Almost everything," he said. She looked at him. "I need to tell you something." He said it carefully with the deliberateness of a man who had been choosing his words for so long that even now when he didn't have to, the habit held. "There's a safe in my father's study. Genevieve changed the combination after he died, or she believes she did. She was not there when he taught me the sequence. He showed me when I was 19. I haven't tried it since I've been in the chair, because I cannot get to the study unobserved." He looked at her steadily. "Whatever is in that safe, my father was the kind of man who kept things for reasons. If there's something in there that relates to the company, to the acquisition, to any of this, we need it before Monday." Or the safe, his father's study, 2 floors up according to the mental map Jolene had been building since day 1. "The Sunday camera review," she said. "Genevieve is occupied for how long?" 90 minutes minimum. She takes it seriously. She watches everything. Then Sunday night, Jolene said, "I'm going to the study." Dominic's expression shifted, not quite fear, not quite protest, something that moved across his face like a shadow before he controlled it. "If she catches you in that room, she won't. You don't know that." "No," Jolene admitted, "but I know that the filing happens Monday, Hewitt comes Tuesday, and if there is something in that safe that Vincent Marchetti kept for a reason, we want it before either of those things happens and not after." She met his eyes. And I know that I did not come this far to stop 2 days before the finish line. He looked at her for a long, searching moment. The kind of look that was trying to understand something about a person that facts couldn't fully explain. You are not what I expected, he said finally. Nobody ever is, Jolene said. Get some rest. Sunday soon. She walked back to her room with her jacket pressed close, the folded document inside it, in the combination to a safe she had never seen turning quietly over and over in her mind, like the tumblers of a lock already beginning to move. Genevieve Marchetti thought she had built an airtight situation. 11 months of careful work, a compliant son, a monitored household, a managed physician and a filtered legal record, and a board meeting 6 weeks away that was going to hand her everything she'd decided she was owed. She had made one mistake that she didn't know about yet. She had hired Jolene Carter to disappear into the background of her plan, and Jolene Carter had never disappeared in her life. Sunday came in quietly the way dangerous days sometimes do, as if the world was holding its breath and hadn't told anyone. Jolene spent the morning being exactly who she always was on Sunday mornings, steady, present, unhurried. She helped Dominic with breakfast. She changed his linens. She sat across the room and read aloud from the Financial Journal while he listened with his eyes closed, not sleeping, just absorbing the way he did when he was working something through in his mind. She had learned to read his stillness the way you learn to read weather. There was the stillness of a man at rest, and there was the stillness of a man coiled, and this morning it was the second kind, and she felt it humming in the space between them like a current neither of them touched. At 2 in the afternoon, Genevieve settled into her study for the Sunday camera review. Jolene heard the door close from 2 hallways away. 90 minutes, Dominic had said. Minimum. She waited 20 minutes before she moved. Not because she wasn't ready, because she was her father's daughter, and her father, whatever his many failures, had understood one thing about timing, that she'd inherited the way other people inherited eye color. You never moved the moment the door closed. You waited for the person inside to stop listening for you. At 20 minutes past 2, she walked to the staircase. The study was on the second floor east wing. She had mapped the route 3 weeks ago, walking it as part of what she told Rosa was a general familiarization with the house. I like to know the layout. It helps me respond faster if Mr. Marchetti needs something. And Rosa had nodded with her eyes aimed at the floor and said nothing, which was Rosa's version of permission. She moved without rushing. Rushing created sound, and sound created narrative, and she could not afford a narrative right now. She was just a caregiver in a large house moving through it. That was all. That was everything. The study door was unlocked. That surprised her for exactly half a second before she understood it. Genevieve didn't lock it because she didn't believe anyone in this house would dare. Control that thorough didn't need a lock. It relied on people being too afraid to try. Jolene was afraid. She went in anyway. Vincent Marchetti's study still felt like Vincent Marchetti's study. Whatever Genevieve had changed after his death, and she changed plenty, Jolene could tell from the gaps, the places where dust patterns suggested furniture had been moved and not replaced. The bones of the room still carried him. The shelves organized with the precision of a man who valued order. The desk positioned to face the door, a power choice deliberate. A man who wanted to see everyone who came to him before they saw him fully. She found the safe behind the third shelf, from the left behind a panel that swung open when you pressed the lower left corner. Dominic had described it with the accuracy of someone who had replayed the memory many times, probably in the dark, probably when there was nothing else to hold on to. She pressed the lower left corner. The panel swung. The safe was there. She entered the combination. The first time, nothing. Her heart rate jumped. She made herself breathe. Entered it again, slower, more deliberate. The safe opened. She had perhaps 60 minutes remaining. She did not waste them. None. There were 4 things inside. An envelope sealed and thick, a USB drive, a second document, this one in a clear sleeve that appeared to be a contract of some kind, and a handwritten letter, 2 pages in the same precise script she had seen in Genevieve's log, except this wasn't Genevieve's handwriting. This was someone else's. Older, more angular. Vincent's. She photographed everything with the prepaid phone before she touched any of it. Then she read the contract first because it was the most legible and the most immediately relevant. It was dated 8 years ago. It was between Vincent Marchetti and a man named Charles Beale, a name she didn't recognize, but the title beneath it told her what she needed to know. Chief Medical Officer, Hargrove Pharmaceutical. She read faster. The contract outlined a consulting arrangement. Hargrove Pharmaceutical would provide Vincent Marchetti with access to certain compounds, currently in clinical trial compounds not yet approved, not yet on any public registry, in exchange for Vincent's facilitation of their introduction to specific distribution networks. Networks the contract made abundantly clear in careful legal language that operated outside conventional regulatory oversight. She sat with that for 3 full seconds. Vincent Marchetti had not just been connected to the Marchetti criminal organization by inheritance. He had been actively moving unapproved pharmaceutical compounds through underground channels, which meant the amber vial, the compound in Dominic's medication, the thing that had been suppressing his recovery for 11 months. It hadn't come from a legitimate prescription that Genevieve had corrupted. It had come from a supply chain that Vincent himself had helped build. A supply chain that Genevieve apparently knew about or had discovered and had decided to use in the most personal way possible. She opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, 8 of them. Dominic perhaps 5 or 6 years ago in various locations, but not candid photographs, not family memories. Surveillance photographs, the kind taken from a distance with equipment that cost money. On the back of each one, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were dates and locations and brief notations. Meeting with Reyes, transfer at the port, contact confirmed. Dominic had been surveilled by his own father, before the accident, before any of this. And then the letter. Vincent's letter, 2 pages undated. She read it once quickly, then read it again because the first time through, she hadn't fully absorbed it. It was written to Dominic. It was clear from the first line, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've found the thing I hoped you'd never need." It went on for 2 pages in the direct, unsentimental language of a man who had done serious things and knew it and had stopped pretending otherwise. He outlined what he'd done with Hargrove. He outlined why financial pressure, a bad year, a decision made quickly that compounded slowly into something he couldn't undo. He outlined what he knew about Genevieve. Not that she would poison Dominic, he hadn't anticipated that specifically, but that she had discovered the Hargrove arrangement and used it. She holds the documentation as leverage. She will use it against you if she needs to. She has always been a woman who plays the longest available game. I loved her once. I want you to understand that, and I want you to protect yourself from it in equal measure. The last paragraph. Jolene read it 3 times. There is a contact at the FBI field office. His name is Daniel Rourke. He approached me 2 years ago about the Hargrove arrangement. I gave him nothing, but I kept his card and I kept my own record of everything. And I left both with this letter because I am a man who built his life on leverage and I want you to have mine when I am gone. His number is below. If you need to burn everything to save yourself, burn it. The company can be rebuilt. You cannot. Below it, a phone number. Jolene sat in Vincent Marchetti's study with a dead man's letter in her hands and felt the entire structure of the situation she was inside rearrange itself around her. This wasn't just about the board meeting anymore. This wasn't just about Genevieve's control over the company. This was about a pharmaceutical supply chain, federal leverage, and a dead man who had tried imperfectly and too late to hand his son a way out. She photographed the letter, the envelope, the USB drive's label. She put everything back exactly as she found it. She closed the safe. She closed the panel. She walked out of the study and down the stairs with her face completely blank and her mind running at a speed she hadn't needed in years. She had 40 minutes before Genevieve's review would end. She used 39 of them in Dominic's room. She closed the door, checked the camera angle. It covered the entry point, but not the full interior, a fact she had confirmed weeks ago, and moved to where he could hear her clearly, but the camera couldn't read her lips. She told him everything, all of it. Fast, precise, in the same stripped-down language he used when he was being real with her. She watched his face as she talked, and what she saw there was not surprise, not fully, but a particular kind of grief that comes from having suspected something and having that suspicion confirmed. The grief of being right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The FBI contact," he said. "Daniel Rourke. Your father kept the number." "My father." He said it in that way. He had the complicated flatness. "Then he surveilled me." "Yes." "Because he didn't trust me, or because he was documenting in case he needed to hand me over?" Jolene did not soften it. "I don't know. The letter reads like a man trying to protect you. But your father was also a man who protected himself first and worked outward from there. She paused. Both things can be true. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, saw the place where love and betrayal lived too close together to separate, saw him decide consciously to set it aside. Not to bury it, to set it aside because there wasn't time for it right now, and he knew it. Rourke, he said, if we contact Rourke, we're not just filing a civil case. We're handing the federal government a door into the Marchetti organization. Yes, into everything my father built. Yes, he looked at her, including things that could put people I know in prison. Yes, she said. Dominic, I know what I'm asking. Do you not aggressive, genuinely asking? I'm asking you to decide how much of what was built wrong you're willing to burn to save yourself. That's what your father said. I'm saying the same thing. She held his gaze. But I'm not the one who has to decide it. It's your life, your family, your call. The silence stretched. She let it stretch. She had learned a long time ago that when someone was making a real decision, the worst thing you could do was fill the quiet with your own noise. He said, call Rourke. She called the number from the prepaid phone at 4:17 in the afternoon. Sitting in her room with the door locked, her heart rate elevated in a way she controlled through sheer stubbornness. It rang 4 times. She had already decided what she would say if it went to voicemail. It didn't go to voicemail. Rourke. The voice was male, middle-aged, the particular economy of a man accustomed to calls that required him to be immediately oriented. My name is Jolene Carter, she said. I'm calling on behalf of Dominic Marchetti. His father kept your number. A pause, not the pause of someone confused, the pause of someone recalibrating quickly. Vincent's son. Yes. How is Vincent? He died, Jolene said. 14 months ago, just before Dominic's accident. Another pause. Longer. What kind of accident? And Jolene understood from the way he asked it, careful leading, already building a frame, that Daniel Rourke was not a man who believed in coincidence. He was a man who had been watching this family for a long time and waiting for a door to open. She told him. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The medication, the documentation, Elaine's filing, Dr. Osei's findings, the letter in the safe, the Hargrove contract. When she finished, Rourke said, Ms. Carter, are you safe where you are right now? The question landed in her sternum, because it was the right question, and it was the question nobody had asked her yet, and the fact that it was the first thing he'd said after hearing all of it told her something important about Daniel Rourke. For now, she said. Monday morning, Elaine Pryor's filing goes in. I know Elaine, by the way, good woman, and the moment it does, Genevieve Marchetti is going to understand that her window is closing. People in closing windows do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, Jolene said. Is there any way to get Dominic out of that house before Monday? She thought about it. The gate code, the cameras, the fact that Dominic was in a wheelchair and visible departure required a vehicle, and a vehicle required coordination that Genevieve controlled. Not without her knowing. Then you need to make sure nothing happens tonight or tomorrow that gives her a reason to accelerate. A pause. I'm going to make some calls. I'll have a presence outside the property by tomorrow morning. Unmarked. You won't see it, but it'll be there. What kind of presence? The kind that discourages certain choices. He said it in a tone that was simultaneously matter-of-fact and deeply serious. Keep your phone on. Don't let Dominic be alone with his mother. She almost said he's never alone with her now, but stopped herself because that wasn't quite true. There were moments, small windows, and small windows she now knew better than ever were exactly what changed everything. One more thing, Rourke said. The Hargrove contract, don't move the original. Don't touch it again. If she checks that safe before we can get in there formally, we need it exactly where it is. Already back in place, Jolene said. A beat. You're very good at this, Miss Carter. I grew up having to be, she said, and hung up. She went to dinner that evening with everything she knew sitting inside her like ballast heavy, stabilizing invisible. Genevieve was at the table. Dominic was at the table. Rosa moved between the kitchen and the dining room with her customary careful silence. And Jolene ate, and responded to small conversation and watched Genevieve the way Genevieve had been watching her, openly enough to seem normal, carefully enough to catch everything. Genevieve was different tonight, not visibly, not in any way that Rosa or a casual observer would register. But Jolene had been studying this woman for 35 days, and she knew her baseline, the way you know the sound of a clock that's been running in the same room for a month. You notice the change before you can name it. Something had shifted in Genevieve. Something had tightened. Jolene ate her dinner and did not show the cold that moved through her at that recognition. After dinner, Genevieve stopped her in the hallway. Not dramatically, just a hand lightly on her arm, the social gesture of a woman who had mastered the appearance of warmth. Jolene, she smiled. I want to make a small change to Dominic's evening routine. Starting tonight, I'll administer the evening medication myself. I'd like to spend a little more time with him in the evenings. A pause. A mother's prerogative. Jolene met her eyes, kept her face soft, kept it open, kept every alarm that was screaming in her nervous system completely invisible. Of course, that's lovely. He'd appreciate the company. Genevieve's smile held for 2 seconds, then she turned and walked toward Dominic's room. Jolene stood in the hallway and did not move for the count of 5. Then she walked, not ran walked to her room, locked the door, picked up the prepaid phone and called Dominic's number. The second phone she had given him 2 weeks ago, the one he kept under the cushion of his wheelchair, the one Genevieve did not know existed. He picked up on the first ring. She's coming to give you the medication herself tonight, Jolene said. Do not take it. His voice was very quiet. How? And tell her you already took it. Tell her I gave it early because you had a headache and needed to rest. Tell her whatever you need to tell her, but do not let that medication into your body tonight. She stopped. Can you do that? A silence. Then, yes. Dominic, she knows something is moving. I don't know how much she knows, but she's changing patterns, and that means she's scared, and scared people make mistakes, he said, or they stop being careful. He said it with the knowledge of a man who had grown up watching powerful people operate. I'll handle it. Be convincing. Jolene, his voice was steady, completely steady. I have been convincing for 11 months. I think I can manage one more evening. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palm flat on her thigh and breathed. Rourke's presence outside the property. Elaine filing in the morning. Dr. Osei's toxicology. The letter in the safe. Daniel Rourke's phone number in her phone and his voice telling her she had done this right. And Dominic's voice steady as ground telling her he could hold one more night. She needed all of it to be enough. At 11:14 that night, her phone buzzed. Text from Dominic's number. 3 words. She believed it. Jolene exhaled so hard she felt it in her ribs. She texted back, sleep. Tomorrow it starts. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the last line of Vincent Marchetti's letter. The company can be rebuilt. You cannot. A man who had built his entire life on material things, writing at the end about the thing that couldn't be replaced or reconstructed. She thought about her own father, about the things he had done and the things he had tried to explain, and the gap between the man who brought her Cuban coffee as a metaphor and the man who had burned his own family's future to the ground. She thought about how you could love someone and be destroyed by them simultaneously, and how that particular math never got easier, no matter how long you carried it. She thought, in the morning this ends. One way or another, in the morning this ends. But morning was still hours away, and somewhere on the other side of the wall, Genevieve Marchetti was awake. Jolene could feel it, that specific charged quality of a house where someone isn't sleeping. She had grown up in enough unsettled places to know what a building felt like when someone in it was making plans. She gripped the phone tighter and watched the ceiling and waited for the light to change. Jolene didn't sleep. Not really. She drifted in and out of something that felt like sleep, the way a shallow puddle feels like water, technically accurate, completely insufficient. Every time she went under, some part of her brain pulled her back up, listening for sounds that didn't belong, measuring the silence of the house against what she knew about the woman on the other side of it. At 5:47 in the morning, she heard footsteps. Not Rosa's footsteps. Rosa didn't start until 7. Not Dominic's. Dominic couldn't produce footsteps like that yet, though she held the knowledge of his improving strength like something precious and guarded, a fact she hadn't let herself fully feel, because feeling it meant believing it was real, and believing it was real meant it could be taken away. These footsteps were Genevieve's. Precise, measured moving with the deliberate calm of someone who had already made a decision and was now simply executing it. Jolene was out of bed before the footsteps reached the end of the hallway. She didn't put on shoes. She moved on socked feet to her door, opened it a crack, and listened. The footsteps turned toward Dominic's room. She heard the knock, two sharp raps, not the soft knock of maternal concern, but the firm knock of someone who expected compliance. She heard Dominic's door open. She was moving down the hallway before she consciously chose to move. She reached Dominic's door and pushed it open without knocking, and the scene she walked into lasted maybe 3 seconds before it locked into her memory with the permanence of something that would never fully leave. Genevieve was standing beside Dominic's bed. She had a paper cup in one hand, the medication cup, the morning dose, and she was extending it toward him with an expression on her face that was composed almost to the point of being serene. Dominic was sitting upright in the bed, and his face was the blank wall, the armor, the thing he wore when he needed to be impenetrable, but his eyes cut to Jolene the moment she appeared in the doorway, and in them it was something she had not seen in 36 days of watching him. Fear, clean and unambiguous, not for himself, for her. Jolene. Genevieve didn't turn around. She knew who it was from the sound of the footsteps, which told Jolene that this woman had been paying attention with a thoroughness that should have been frightening, and somehow wasn't, because if Genevieve was afraid enough to accelerate to a 6 in the morning confrontation, then what Jolene had set in motion was already working. "You're up early." "I heard movement," Jolene said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything is fine." Genevieve finally turned the paper cup, still extended, but now positioned differently toward Jolene, almost offering. "I was just giving Dominic his morning medication." "I usually do that," Jolene said. "I know you do." The gray eyes were doing what they always did, assessing, measuring, looking for the crack. "But I have some concerns about the consistency of his routine lately, and I thought I'd step in directly." A pause that carried weight. "You understand, I'm sure, as his mother." Jolene looked at Dominic. He gave her nothing visible, but his left hand resting on the bedsheet moved a single deliberate press of his fingers against the fabric. Their signal, the one they'd worked out 2 weeks ago. "Don't engage." "Wait," she looked back at Genevieve. "Of course," she said. "Can I get you some coffee while you're with him?" Something moved in Genevieve's expression, almost surprise, almost suspicion. Then it smoothed over. "That would be lovely. Thank you." Jolene walked to the kitchen with her pulse in her throat and her hands absolutely still. She picked up the prepaid phone from her apron pocket and called Rourke. He answered in 2 rings. "Carter. She's in his room with the medication. Early. It's not the routine." "How early?" "Before 6. A sharp intake of breath, then controlled. Don't let him take it. I have 2 agents at the gate right now. I can have them inside in 4 minutes if you give me a reason." "Give me 3, she said. She made the coffee. She carried it back to Dominic's room and found Genevieve seated in the chair beside the bed. Jolene's chair, she registered the one she always used, and Dominic holding the paper cup. Not having taken it. Holding it. His eyes met hers over the rim as she came through the door, and the expression in them was so controlled it hurt to look at. She set the coffee on the small table beside Genevieve and said in the voice of a woman who had decided to stop being careful because they were past careful, now past the window for it, "Mrs. Marchetti, I need to tell you something." Genevieve wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Yes, I need to tell you that Elaine Pryor filed with the court this morning at 8 a.m. Eastern, which was," she checked her watch, "11 minutes ago." The room went absolutely still. Genevieve's hands did not move. Her face did not move. And that was the most frightening thing. Not rage, not denial, not the explosion that lesser people would have produced. Just stillness. The stillness of a woman who had not survived in the world she'd survived in by being reactive. "I see," Genevieve said. "I also need to tell you that Dr. Patricia O.C.'s neurological report is part of that filing, along with a toxicology analysis of a compound found in Mr. Marchetti's afternoon medication that is not in any form part of his official prescription." Jolene held her voice level, held every syllable, even held herself together with both hands. "And that Dominic's written account of the last 11 months, signed and dated and witnessed, is also part of that filing." Genevieve turned and looked at Dominic. What passed across her face in that moment was something Jolene had not expected and would not forget. It wasn't fury, it was grief. Real grief, fast and unguarded there for one raw second before she shut it down. The grief of a woman who had gone so far down a road that she had lost sight of who she had originally been walking toward. "Dominic," she said, soft, the first genuinely soft thing Jolene had ever heard from her. "Don't," he said, just that one word in a voice that was quiet and final and carried 11 months of weight. Genevieve set down the coffee cup. She straightened. She became, in the span of 2 seconds, the composed woman in the charcoal suit who had sat in a church and offered a desperate woman what looked like salvation. "You have no idea," she said to Jolene now, "what you have involved yourself in." "I have a very good idea," Jolene said. "I've been inside this house for 36 days. "This family is not what you used it for," Jolene said. And then, because it needed to be said, and she was the one standing there to say it, Dominic put the cup down. He set it on the nightstand without taking his eyes off his mother. And then in the silence that followed, a sound from outside the door. Footsteps again, but different this time. More than one person. The measured pace of people who wore credentials and knew how to enter a room without signaling intention until they were already inside. Rourke hadn't waited for her 3 minutes. He'd given her 2.5 and come anyway. Daniel Rourke was a tall man in his late 40s, the kind of face that didn't announce itself, the kind of presence that settled into a room like pressure changing before a storm. He had 2 agents with him. He showed Genevieve his credentials with the particular quiet of a man who understood that theater was unnecessary when the facts were already in the room. "Mrs. Marchetti," and he said, "we've been wanting to have a conversation for about 2 years. I appreciate you making yourself available." Genevieve looked at him, then at Jolene, then at Dominic, who had not moved, who was sitting in his bed with the posture of a man who had been holding himself together through will alone and had just been told he could put some of it down. She said nothing. That was her choice, and Jolene recognized it as the choice of someone who had access to legal counsel and knew better than to speak without it. Even now, even in this. She maintained herself with a composure that was, on some level, Jolene didn't want to examine too closely, extraordinary. Rourke's agents moved with the quiet efficiency of people doing a job they had done many times. One stayed with Genevieve. One moved to secure the study they knew about the safe Jolene had told Rourke, and Rourke had come prepared. Rourke looked at Jolene. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. He looked at Dominic. "Mr. Marchetti, I'm glad you're still here." Dominic looked at him with those dark, awake eyes and said, "My father kept your card." "Your father," Rourke said carefully, "was a complicated man who made complicated choices. We can talk about that, all of it, but right now I want to make sure you get a doctor in here today, a legitimate one, and that we start the process of getting your medical records set straight." Dominic nodded once. Then he looked at Jolene, and what was in his face in that moment was not complicated at all. It was simple. It was the simplest thing she'd seen in this house. "Thank you," he said. She had spent 36 days inside a situation designed to make everyone inside it smaller. She had spent her whole life being told she was her father's name before she was her own person. She had $43 in a church on a Wednesday morning, and a woman with gray eyes and a long game had offered her what looked like an answer. She had turned that into this moment, this room, this man looking at her and saying thank you with the full weight of what those 2 words carried. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs, old habit, her steadying gesture worn into muscle memory from years of needing to hold herself together in rooms that wanted her undone. "You're welcome," she said. Rosa was in the hallway when Jolene came out. She was standing against the wall with a dish towel in her hands and her eyes aimed somewhere between the floor and the middle distance, which was Rosa's entire emotional range compressed into a single image. She had heard everything. From the sound of it, she had been standing there since the knock on Dominic's door. She looked up when Jolene came out. "Is he?" she started. "He's going to be fine," Jolene said. "More than fine." Rosa pressed her lips together, nodded small and contained. Then she said, "I'll make breakfast." It was such a Rosa thing to say, so completely characteristically Rosa the world upending itself and her response being to feed people that Jolene almost laughed. Almost. She settled for putting her hand briefly on Rosa's arm, a light contact acknowledgement, and then she walked back to her room to call Elaine. Elaine picked up before the first ring finished. "It went through," she said. The filing is stamped. I have confirmation. A pause that held 60 years of legal practice and 12 years of a debt she'd wanted to repay. How is he, Bob? Awake, Jolene said. Himself. Rourke is here. Rourke. Elaine made a sound that was between approval and resignation. I always figured it would come to that eventually. Vincent left more threads loose than he thought. She paused. And you, how are you, child? Nobody had asked her that in 36 days. The word child from a 71-year-old woman who had zero obligation to her should not have done what it did to the inside of her chest. But it did. I'm standing, Jolene said. That's the whole job sometimes, Elaine said. I'll be there by noon. The next 4 hours moved in the way that consequential hours do, quickly and slowly simultaneously, dense with event and yet somehow unreal, as if Jolene was watching it from a slight remove while also being completely inside it. Rourke's team worked through the study. A physician Rourke brought arrived and examined Dominic with the kind of thoroughness that left no room for the ambiguity Genevieve had spent 11 months cultivating. Marcus Ewan, Dominic's lawyer, who hadn't returned his calls in 2 months, appeared at the door within an hour of the filing, becoming public record, making the kind of rapid recalibration that lawyers make when they understand which way a situation has decisively moved. And Dominic let him in with the cool courtesy of a man who had a long memory and would address that conversation at a later date. And then Elaine arrived precisely at noon in a gray wool coat and sensible shoes, and the energy of a woman who had been waiting 12 years for this particular morning. She walked straight to Dominic, looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his face between her hands, both her hands small and dry and firm, and she said, "Your father would have gotten here eventually. He just ran out of time." Dominic's expression cracked just slightly, just enough. "I know," he said. "You're going to be all right," she said. "The board meeting stands. You'll be there." "In 6 weeks," he said. "Sooner." She released his face, became efficient, practical, the woman who had been doing this for 50 years. "We move for an emergency competency declaration this week. With Dr. Osei's findings in the toxicology, it's unopposable. The board will be notified by Friday." She pulled out a folder she had brought, a folder of course she had, and got to work. Jolene stood near the doorway and watched all of it unfold and felt for the first time in 36 days the particular loosening of attention she'd been holding so continuously she'd stopped registering it as a thing she was doing. Like putting down a weight you'd been carrying so long, you'd forgotten you were carrying it. At 2 in the afternoon, the house was quieter. Rourke's team had taken what they needed. Genevieve had left, not in handcuffs, not yet. The legal process was a longer road than a single morning, and everyone in that house understood that. But she had left with one agent accompanying her, and the understanding, delivered in Rourke's measured tone, that she was not to leave the city and that the conversation they needed to have would be scheduled within 48 hours. She had walked out with her chin level and her coat straight and her face composed, and she did not look back. Jolene was in the hallway when she passed. Genevieve stopped. Just for a moment. Just long enough to really look at her, not the assessing surveillance look, but something more human, something tired underneath the composure. "You are not what I thought you were," Genevieve said. "No," Jolene agreed. "I'm not." A beat. "Your father, Ballista, is mine to deal with." "Oh," Jolene said quietly. "Not yours." Something moved in Genevieve's gray eyes. She nodded once and walked out of the house, and the sound of the front door closing behind her felt like a chapter ending, which it was. Dominic asked Jolene to come back to his room at 3 o'clock. Just him. No Elaine, no Rourke, no Marcus Ewan. She sat in her chair again, and he sat across from her, and the light came through the window, and neither of them spoke for a full minute, which was its own kind of luxury. Then he said, "I want to try something." She looked at him. He gripped both arms of the wheelchair. She watched his arms, his hands the set of his shoulders. She watched him breathe in slow and deliberate and breathe out. And then with an effort that moved across his entire body in a visible wave, he pushed. He stood. Not for long, not easily. His legs shook and she was out of her chair before she had decided to move her hands, going to his arm automatically, not to catch him, just to be there, just so he knew there was something solid beside him if he needed it. He stood for 7 seconds. She counted them, not aloud, just in her chest, one for each day of the week. And then he lowered himself back into the chair and sat with his head bowed and his hands gripping his own knees and breathed through whatever that cost him. She stayed standing beside him, her hand still on his arm. 7 seconds, she said. He looked up. His eyes were bright, not tears, or not only tears, something bigger than tears, the expression of a man reclaiming a thing that had been taken from him and feeling the full weight of what that reclamation meant. Next time, he said, it'll be more. Next time, she agreed, it will be. She called her father that evening. From her real phone, not the burner. She sat on the edge of her bed in the room that had been her world for 36 days and listened to the prison line ring. And when he picked up and said Jolene in that voice of his, surprised, careful, hopeful, in the way people are hopeful when they don't feel they've earned the right to it, she said, I did something today, Dad. I want to tell you about it, Mom. She heard him settle. She heard the long breath he took, and she told him. Not everything, not the parts that were still Dominic's private things to carry, but enough, the church, what she'd found and what she'd done with it and how it ended. When she finished, her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, that's my girl. She had spent 15 years not wanting to be his. She sat with those 3 words and felt them find the part of her that had always been both of those things simultaneously her father's daughter and entirely her own. And she let them be true at the same time without having to choose. I know, she said softly. I know, Dad. 3 weeks later, Dominic Marchetti walked into his father's company boardroom on his own 2 feet. Not easily, not without the evidence of what 11 months had cost him, the slight unevenness in his gait, the way he held himself with the careful deliberateness of a man rebuilding muscle and trust simultaneously. But he walked, without assistance, without a wheelchair, without a single molecule of the compound that had been systematically introduced into his bloodstream by the woman who raised him. He stood at the head of the table, his father's, which was now his table, and looked around the room at the 12 faces assembled there, and he said in the low, precise voice of a man who had survived something and come out of it knowing exactly who he was, I understand there was some question about my capacity to lead this company. I'd like to resolve that question today. Nobody in that room said a word. Jolene was not in that room. She had never needed to be. Her part of this story had always been the part that happened before the boardroom, the part in the hallways and the borrowed phones and the church on a Wednesday morning when she'd sat in a pew and asked for something to change. She was in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the building when his text came through. It was 3 words, it's done, come. She looked at those words for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee, put on her jacket, the jacket with the interior pocket, the one she'd bought for this, the one she'd worn through 36 of the most consequential days of her life. And she walked out into the late morning sun with her shoulders back and her name hers and nothing following her like a shadow anymore. Jolene Carter had walked into a trap that was disguised as a miracle, seen it for what it was, and dismantled it piece by piece with $43 worth of nerve and a lifetime's worth of paying attention. She had walked in with nothing. She walked out knowing exactly who she was. And that was the kind of wealth that nobody, not a gray-eyed woman with gardenia perfume, not a locked cabinet, not 11 months of careful poison, could ever take from her again.